episode, we talk about the licensing minefield, how councils have more powers than the police when it comes to property inspections, and the inside story of a landlord slapped with a £105,000 fine by the council. With our special guest, Compliance Director of Landlord Licensing Defence, Phil Tent. It's really great to have you on and talk about the private rented sector and also licensing as well, as that's such a big topic that we hear about a lot on Property 118. So before I pick your licensing brain, it would be really great if we could just go back a little bit in time, and if I could just ask how landlord licensing and defence first got started, as obviously I know you help landlords and letting agents avoid these, well, sometimes huge council fines and penalties, which can cost thousands of pounds. But it would be really nice if we could just go back a little bit in time and just hear how you first got started.
Okay, well, it's almost accidentally, I guess, really. It happened, 7 or 8 years ago now. My business partner, Des Taylor, and I used to meet up regularly at property meetings that we both went to. And, over a pint of beer afterwards, on a few occasions, Des was sort of bemoaning the fact that so many people were coming to him asking him for advice and questions when they got in trouble with the councils. Now, Des and I were both landlords. Des had a big portfolio of HMOs, and I was more into property developing at the time, refurbishing wrecked houses and flats, that sort of thing. So between us, an awful lot of knowledge of the law regarding housing and also the practicalities of how buildings work. So the more Des told me about the problems that people were bringing, eventually I said, well, come on, Des, there's a massive need growing here. We should think about setting this up as a business. So we did our business planning, we thought about it. We realised that as well as the legal side of helping people when they are in trouble with the council, there was all the compliance stuff, which is my side of the business, of helping them not to get into trouble in the first place. And you see our name is Landlord Licensing Defence. Our strapline, which isn't on this slide, is defence through compliance. So the first line of defence is actually to get your properties to comply with all the laws and regulations that there are, so that you're not going to get in trouble with the council. It's like making sure you don't have bald tyres on your car. Same sort of idea, and the exhaust pipe's not falling off, and the door handles are connected, and the door's not going to fly open. All those sort of things, but pick that idea up and apply it to your properties, and then if you can do all those things, and the Herculean job is to actually understand all of the things that you're required to do. So that's how we came about, and we've been going, 7 or 8 years now, I guess. We're into the thousands of landlords helped. We deal with rent repayment orders, we deal with licensing problems, we deal with civil penalties when landlords get in trouble with the council, defending against those, sometimes going up to tribunal cases when councils are being really difficult or silly. But we'll come on to that, I'm sure, in the later in the interview, with some of the silly things that councils are doing to landlords.
Exactly. And that's great to hear as well, how it first got started, as you were saying, sort of by accident, but then how it's just grown and grown since then. That's really great to hear.
In some ways, sadly, it continues to grow because the need just gets bigger and bigger.
Exactly. As you say, the need just gets bigger and bigger. And as you were touching on there, sort of about all the rules and regulations landlords have to follow. And I know you've previously said that landlord licensing and defence protects landlords from themselves. And I know it sounds kind of harsh. I know you don't mean it in a too harsh way, but obviously because there's so many rules and regulations landlords have to follow, it can just be really hard to keep up to date with all the legislation. So firstly, is there actually a figure on how many rules and regulations landlords have to follow? Do we actually have a ballpark figure for this?
We do, and it's something like, and I did try and actually list these all out once. I got most of the way, but in the industry, it's there's about 160 pieces of actual legislation that apply to landlords and
Oh,
over 400 regulations.
wow, really? And that must cover a lot of rules and regulations. So it covers sort of licensing, I imagine, and other things.
It's all sorts of areas. I've got a little list here. So the main ones are the Housing Act 2004, the Landlord and Tenant Act 1985, the Housing Health and Safety Rating System, which is how councils inspect properties for problems. That's actually in the Housing Act. The HMO management regulations, if you've got an HMO. The Regulatory Reform Fire Safety Order 2005, all the fire regulations. The Building Safety Act from 2022, that's impacted on flats and HMOs. And then there's all sorts of British standards like BS 5839 for fire alarms, BS 5266 for emergency lighting, BS 8214 for fire doors, and on it goes. Yeah, and it, unfortunately, the way that the legislation and regulations in this country work, most of them tell you what you can't do and therefore what you'll get prosecuted for not doing, but they're not prescriptive. They don't actually tell you what you need to do. And that's what makes it such a minefield. There's all sorts of guidance that will help. And even though they're not retrospective, the building regulations are a very good place. Landlords really ought to understand the building regulations, because if they comply with those or as near as they can, they're a good way to providing decent housing. But then there's all sorts of things like poor EPCs, poor insulation. Do you have double glazing? Is the heating system up to scratch? And I inspect thousands of properties myself every year, as do my team. And I think in 97% of the properties we go to, the fire precautions are not up to standard, which is not safe for the tenants. And it's not good news for the landlords either, because if the council come to inspect, then you're looking at a 25 to 30,000 fine for poor fire prevention. And that's if a fire doesn't happen. If a fire does happen, then we're increasingly seeing landlords prosecuted in court and given custodial jail sentences. Yeah.
Oh, really? Jail?
Jail.
Oh,
Case in Sheffield published, actually went out on 118 yesterday, I think. Yeah, case in Sheffield, the landlord, there were no fire doors or no proper fire doors, no proper fire alarms, and the stairs collapsed. The firemen fell through the stairs because they weren't protected underneath to make them last 30 minutes in the fire. And there were 12 residents trapped upstairs that couldn't get out because the stairs had gone. And they weren't forewarned of the fire because there weren't proper alarms. And the fire wasn't held in the room where it started because there wasn't a fire door. It's all fairly simple stuff, but unfortunately, many landlords don't understand. They never actually engage brain and stand in a place and think, okay, what happens if there's a fire in that bedroom? What happens if there's a fire in that kitchen? Where's the fire going to go? Where's the smoke going to go? They don't understand either that it's actually smoke that kills most people. The smoke in a fire is full of poison, cyanide, carbon monoxide, all sorts of horrible, evil stuff. The smoke is usually about 200 degrees C, which will fry the insides of your lungs. Oh, it's horrendous. So your chances are you'll die of poisoning or fried lungs before you get burnt.
That's absolutely awful.
It's horrendous. And we're here, we do help landlords that get themselves accidentally into trouble. What we can't cope with is the people that do this deliberately, that take no care for their tenants, and don't do fire doors and don't do fire alarms and all that sort of stuff. We're not here to protect that. We're here to educate that. And if they call us out to do a compliance inspection, we will cover all the fire, all the health and safety, all the amenity standards, and tell them exactly what they need to do to make the place compliant. It's usually a 200-page report. I know. Just things like, have they fitted restrictors on the upstairs windows to stop a drunk or a child falling out? No. Are there proper handrails on the staircase such that if Granny comes to visit and she trips on the stairs, is there something solid for her to grab hold of to stop her going right the way down the stairs and breaking a hip? Those sort of things that people just don't stop and think about.
Exactly, as you were saying, it's sort of these little things, isn't it, that you don't think about but are so incredibly important, like these fire alarms and so forth. And I imagine a lot of landlords might be thinking right now, I've probably broken one or two rules and regulations, but by accident, because there are just so many of them. But, and secondly, they'll probably be thinking, how can I actually avoid getting caught out by all these rules and regulations because there's so many of them? What's your advice on that?
Mm-hmm. Well, there are two ways to find out what the problems are. One is to let the council in which case you're going to get prosecuted and fined because that's now their main function. Or you get someone like ourselves, one of my inspectors, to come and inspect. They know exactly what they're looking for. They've had all the same training, in fact, more training than the council people. And we will tell the landlord exactly what needs to be done to make the property compliant. They don't need to do that every year, but you really do need to do that once at the start of renting out a property. And then you've got a fairly good idea of what you need to keep on top of. That's the education phase. So basically it's compliance inspection. And it's not a cheap thing to do, but it's a very sensible thing to do, particularly when you're looking at fines of 30, 40, 50, 60,000, which I'm sure we'll come on to. But we get people coming to us, landlords, every week with 60, 70,000 pound fines, and then a rent repayment order. It's horrendous. There's one that I might mention a bit later on, where the property worth 220,000, the landlord got fines of 105,000.
My goodness.
So, and the councils get to keep this money, so they're very, very motivated to raise fines on us landlords. So, absolutely get a private firm in to come and do an inspection, compliance inspection, and report that is private, confidential, only for you, the landlord. And you'll get guidance and advice on how to do the things as well as what needs doing. Get those things done. Usually we go back in, do a re-inspection afterwards, and then we can sign it off and give the landlord if you like, a certificate that all is good. And at that stage, a formal legal fire risk assessment. Now we find with fire risk assessments that councils are now using those as evidence in their prosecution. So if you've got a fire risk assessment that says A, B, C, D are wrong, that you've got faulty fire doors or a faulty fire alarm, it used to be the way that the fire risk assessments were set up, you'd get this list of things that needed doing, you'd do them, you'd sign that you'd done them, and then you've got a perfectly legal situation. Nobody was prosecuted because you'd done what you were told to do. Councils don't see it that way. They go, ha ha, evidence, got you. So what we now do at Landlords Defence is we do the compliance inspection, we do the fire risk assessment, but not as a legal document. It's in part of the schedule of works. Provided they do all those things, we go back in and the fire risk assessor inspects at that stage so that a nice clean fire risk assessment can be done after the works so that the landlord isn't going to get prosecuted based on that. So everything we do is about helping the landlord not to get prosecuted. And then obviously the other side of the business, the legal side, Des and his team help them to get out of the doo-doo if they do get themselves into it. Okay.
Very helpful. That's really helpful. Thank you, Phil. Some very, very helpful top tips there. And it's great to hear how landlord licensing and defence can help with that. And if we can just move on now to another big topic that we also hear a lot about on Property 118. It's about councils doing property inspections. Now, we all know that tenants have the right to quiet enjoyment. But what a lot of people might not know is that the council can still inspect the property even if a tenant and landlord refuses. Now, it seems to me that councils just have so much power when it comes to inspecting properties. So, well, my first question is just how much power do councils actually have when it comes to inspecting properties?
Okay. Well, you're right that the tenants have the right to quiet enjoyment from the landlord, not from the council. So the council actually has more powers than the police to enter your home. And they can do that. They can actually do that at any time they want. Normally, they will give 24 hours or maybe a little bit more notice using a thing called a Section 239 notice. That's Section 239 of the Housing Act, which is where they get their powers to enter. But in Section 239, it actually says the local housing authority may enter the premises in question at any reasonable time for the purposes of carrying out a survey or examination of the premises in regards to health and safety or any of parts 1 to 4 of the Housing Act, which is basically most of it. So basically, if they want to, they can come in now. If you refuse, it's a criminal act to refuse, and they will simply go away and come back with a warrant. So normally they'll give 24 hours notice to the tenants. They won't tell the landlord. Quite often, if it's what they consider a part 2, which is an HMO contravention, usually an unlicensed HMO, they'll do a dawn raid at 5 o'clock in the morning with 8 or so officers, very often dressed to look like police. And they'll basically just threaten their way in. We hear so many stories of them telling foreign nationals that if they don't let them in, they'll get them deported. I say they do a drug style raid at 5 o'clock in the morning to try and catch people in bed and count the people in beds and then claim that they're all living there. I don't know why, but councils seem to think that an unlicensed HMO is second only to murder. Seriously, it's absolutely incredible.
God, yeah, and as you were saying there, they literally have more powers than the police when it comes to inspecting properties.
Yeah, the police have to get a warrant to get inside. The council
Uh-huh.
doesn't. No. So
Really
usually they
interesting.
just come to the door and talk their way in.
And as you were saying there, they dress up, what did you say?
In
They
some,
dress
in
up
some
as
areas, they dress up. They look very similar to police officers. Yeah.
absolutely God. It doesn't even seem real, does it?
Well,
When
no,
you
I
see
mean,
like
we're a bit sort of jaundiced to it all now because we hear about
mm,
it so often. But yeah,
mm,
absolutely. People, landlords in general, just do not understand that this is going on. And they say, "Oh yes, we've got a good relationship with the council."
mm,
Those same
mm.
council people will invite you in for a meeting, which then turns out to be an interview under caution because they can do under caution recorded interviews the same as the police. And you'll go in for this meeting they've invited you to, and all of a sudden, instead of "Hello Joe," it's "Hello Mr. So and So," and no, "I'm Mrs. So and So. I'm not Jenny anymore." And they'll take you into a small room with all the recording apparatus, and they will say, they have to say, you do not have to say anything in evidence, but of course, once you're there, you say, "Well, what's going on? I haven't done anything wrong. I'm going to talk." And the purpose of it's called a PACE interview. The purpose of that is really, same with the police, to extract evidence that they haven't got. So if you ever get invited to a chat at the council, It's going to be a pace interview under caution. Do not go without getting professional advice from somebody like ourselves, or, well, I wouldn't say high street solicitor because they don't know. You need a property specialist solicitor, or even better, people like ourselves that do this all day long and do nothing else. Scary.
Very, very scary indeed. And as we were saying, licensing can be a minefield with all the rules and regulations. And I mean, you were touching on there about some of the horror stories that you've heard. Are there, I mean, what's the worst one that you've probably had when you've been dealing with councils? I know you were mentioning a few there, but could you name the worst one that you've
Yeah,
come
sure.
across?
So I think I mentioned that as far as councils are concerned, the most heinous crime of all is not licensing an HMO. And just for viewers, an HMO is not just 5 people or more. HMO starts at 3 people sharing a house. If they're not all related by blood or sexual union, so if you've got 3 people and one of them, just one of them isn't related to the other 2, that is already an HMO. Yeah. Now that doesn't always require licensing. That depends on your local council. Every HMO that has 5 or more people requires mandatory licensing. The 3s and 4 people ones, that's if your council's got a scheme called additional licensing in place. And you have to ferret about on their website to find out, because it's not, they don't make it easy. So the worst case, I'm going to take us up to Northampton a couple of years ago. There was a terrace house, which was a 5 or 6 person HMO. And it was a bit of a heap. It wasn't good. The tenants weren't happy. And the council took their time. They left the tenants there in mortal danger for 5 years. So when I went to inspect this place, when the landlord finally got fined by the council for not licensing it, and for a whole range of items under the HMO management regulations, and this was the chap that got £105,000 worth of fines. So I went up to cases like this where it's really bad. I always go and do the inspection personally. Now, within minutes of getting in there, I would have had everybody out, condemned the place completely, because most of the fire alarms had been taken off the ceiling. None of the fire doors fitted properly. They got the gaps around a fire door are supposed to be between 2 and 4 millimeters. These were about 1 inch. That's 25 millimeters in places. One, somebody had put his foot right through it, just broke the door in a great chunk off the door. Right mess. And all these people, if a fire had happened, somebody was going to die. Now, the council had every year written to the landlord saying, you need to license this property, and if you don't, we will enforce strongly against you. Well, after 5 years of them doing this and doing nothing, just sending them a letter once a year, the landlord thought, well, this is a joke, there's no need to do anything. Finally, however, the council got all their evidence that they needed to issue these £105,000 of fines. But they still didn't do anything to protect the tenants. They just left them there. And when they issue these fines under the HMO management regulations, there's actually no requirement on the landlord to fix stuff. Just the threat that if he doesn't fix it, they'll come back again and have some more money, thank you. So it was me and my team that made the house safe for the residents, not the council. They did nothing at all. We went in, we did, as I said, the schedule of works. The guy himself was getting a bit on the old side. His daughter, very clever lady, she came in and managed all the renovations that needed to be done. And within 4 weeks, we'd got new fire doors on every door. We'd got a completely new alarm system. We'd done lots of other improvements. We got rid of all the damp and mold. Council that had 5 years, and all they were interested in was, how can we get a case for £105,000? And to hell with the tenants. We ended up with a completely new HMO, effectively, the daughter as the manager. The tenants all wanted to stay. The tenants that had been complaining about the landlord now that the daughter was in, now that the work had been done, beautiful HMO, all only too happy to stay. And we did manage to negotiate harshly with the council and got the fines down to 50,000, but it's still a hell of a chunk out of the man's pension pot.
Mm.
So yeah, that was one of the worst. There's a whole load of equally worst ones I could tell you about that take us hours. Maybe another day.
Yeah, exactly. We'll have to have you on just as so you could talk about all the stories. All the stories. It just doesn't seem real, does it? And that's absolutely awful that you were the ones that were actually did the work, made up this HMO, and the council just didn't do anything. Just
They were
absolutely awful.
only interested in the money.
Yeah,
And I think
absolutely.
we'll come on to that in a bit as to what drives councils now, because it's important that landlords learn about that.
Exactly. And that was just going to be my next question, because as we've been talking about, the fines and penalties can be absolutely huge, into their thousands. And, but also the cost of licenses are really expensive. I mean, in some places, like in Nottingham, I think the selective license is like £900, and then you've got other places in London, £800. So firstly, why are these licenses so expensive? And why do they vary across each council as well?
Right, that's a very interesting question. And it comes down to the councils, each council is independent. We've got 340 something councils. We have 340 something sets of rules because each make up their own rules. They each make up their own licensing scheme. And then they do what I can only describe as creative accounting. And the reason I say that is, yeah, you're absolutely right. Selective licenses, 5-year license, sometimes only a 3-year license if they don't like you particularly as a landlord. Same fee, often £800 to £1,000. I think one council even tried to go up to £1,200 on selective licensing up in the northwest. HMOs up to something like 2,000, 2,500, I believe, in some places. Massive amounts of money. But let's just stick with the selective licensing. In Jersey, last year, they introduced their version of selective licensing. £60. £60. So if Jersey can do it for £60, and they're doing it as a 2-year license, and then every 2 years you have to resubmit all your documents and pay another £60. So okay, so it's more like £150 over 5 years compared to £1,000. And they're checking everything every 2 years. So it's far better for the tenants. And it actually helps the landlords because every 2 years they know they've got to get all their tests and documents in order. And all of that can be done for £60 every 2 years. So it's a taxation, isn't it? Yeah.
Exactly.
The councils are, we all know, they're going bust, they're strapped for cash. And 2 big sources of income they've realised are 1, licence fees, 2, fining landlords and keeping the cash. What can we say?
What can we say indeed? I mean, we've been talking about, how not very good councils have actually been, haven't we? So what can councils actually do to improve the relationship with landlords?
Well, there's a lot they could do, but there's nothing they're going to do. Because, well, whilst they are motivated by the governments that they can raise revenue through fining landlords and through operating licensing schemes, like any organisation, they're money driven, revenue driven. And the reason that they don't educate landlords is because that's shooting their business in the foot. If they educate landlords what they need to do, then they're not going to go wrong. So the council's not going to get the fines. It's awful. It's absolutely corrupt and absolutely awful. But
It's not good at all.
No, I mean the days when the council was staffed by good old-fashioned environmental health officers, housing officers. These were highly trained people. They were true professionals in their discipline, and their interests were safety, health and safety, nice homes for tenants. And they would work offline with landlords. The first line of approach would be tenant calls and they go and look. "Oi, Mr. Landlord, this and this is wrong at your property. I'll be back in a fortnight." If I come back in a fortnight, it's all done, everything's good, and I'll go away again. All informal. Then obviously they did have lots of powers under the Housing Act. And if you hadn't done the stuff, then yeah, they'd move into the enforcement phase. Absolutely fine. It's the way it should be. But now it's enforcement first, revenue first. And as we've seen with the example I gave and lots of others, they don't actually care that much about the tenants anymore, because they don't, it's not the environmental health officers anymore. It's people called enforcement officers.
Mm.
They're not trained in housing. They're trained, and a lot of them come in from the police and things like that. They're only recruited to prosecute landlords. I've actually been on some enforcement training courses that the council people go on. They start with the premise that all landlords are criminals. That's the first thing they tell them. And then they go through all the different legislation that you can use to get a landlord. So if this one doesn't work, you can go for the Environmental Act, or you can go for the management regulations, or you can go for HHSRS. But all these different things in their tool bag to get the landlord. And so what happens? All these licensing schemes, just to go back to licensing, they're allegedly brought in to sort out rogue landlords. The one part of the market they have no effect on whatsoever is rogue landlords, because it's only the good landlords and the reasonable landlords that sign up. The reasonable landlords are the ones that have always got things wrong, even though they're trying hard and they're providing decent accommodation. You'll always go in and find something wrong, and those are the ones that the councils go, "Whoa, easy money." Dreadful.
Honestly, it's absolutely awful. And as you were saying there, it's the good landlords that are getting punished for it, not actually the rogue criminal landlords that actually do need to get punished for it. It's just absolutely awful. And my last final question, if we can just squeeze one last question in, is that the future at the moment looks really uncertain, because obviously we've got the surprise general election announcement. And I mean, a lot of landlords are worried, especially if a Labour government come in. So, what is the future? What do you think about the future of the private rented sector?
Now, that's a difficult one. I mean, we've had 14 years of the Tories who've frankly done landlords no favours whatsoever. They've taxed them out of existence. They've regulated them out of existence. They've supported all these licensing schemes that are just basically another tax. They took away all the tax, Section 24, allowing you to offset interest against tax like every other business in the world or in the UK. So it makes you think, well, can Labour do an any worse job? They were talking about bringing in rent controls. Thankfully, they scrapped that last year, so that's a good thing. Starmer's talking a lot about boosting housing supply. Well, that's got to be a good thing. I mean, it doesn't help property prices, but property prices, I think we've got to say, have got completely out of control. The supply is minimal. Rents are unaffordable. It's got to be sorted out, and the only way is to build more houses. Now, Labour are talking about building some new towns, you know, like the Milton Keyneses of when was that? The 70s, I guess. So it's time to stop messing about with little bits here and little bits there, and actually say, right, this large area, we're going to build 100,000 homes, shopping centre, the lot. And I think that's something that's got to happen. Buy-to-let landlords, they're talking about backing first-time buyers in ways that will stop landlords and second home buyers getting in there first. So that made life a little bit more difficult. But you go back to these new towns, they're talking about building those with 40% social housing. So that would be really good because it will get the social housing back where it needs to be in the social sector and not trying to get private landlords to do a job they're not qualified to do. Because doing social landlording is a very different job to just doing private landlording. What else are they going to do? They're talking about more licensing for holiday homes, but that's more or less the same as the Tories. Serious overhaul of the leasehold system. That's brave. Needs doing, but it's very brave. And going back to the EPCC insulation idea, but within a decade. It needs doing. There's so many horrible, cold Victorian properties, all now in the rental sector. Needs sorting out. Far too expensive. Would have been better to knock them down years ago. Now I'm going to get pilloried for that. But honestly, when I was doing development, everybody says, "Oh, how well the Victorian houses were built." Yeah, they were built solidly, but not well. And they, they were built for a different era, a different way of heating with big coal fires that drew air through the building. Well, we sealed all that up, so now they go rotten and mouldy. So a lot of work to be done there, but that needs a scheme. It's a government-backed scheme to insulate all these places and force it to happen. A bit like, when we changed gas from coal gas to natural gas. You're too young to remember that. But it was like a national scheme where it just went house, 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 house. Every house down the street had to be done. But it's going to need something like that. So I don't see that happening. But yeah, obviously the Section 21, Section 21 no fault. I don't like that no fault. It's no reason. The landlord doesn't have to give a reason. Equally, I've seen landlords use that when some friends of mine recently, the landlord informally tried to raise the rent by 20%. People said, "Well, we can't afford that. We're in voluntary credit arrangements following COVID and all that." So the landlord simply issued a Section 21. Now that's not fair, and that shouldn't be being done. And I've been defending that good landlords would never throw out a good tenant. These people have been there 5 years paying their rent. That bit has got to change.
Exactly, I agree. And as you said, a good landlord doesn't want to throw out a good tenant. So I'm going to have to end it there, I'm afraid, Phil. But thank you so much for coming on. We will definitely need you to come back on again to tell all your stories. So thank you so much again, Phil. Really appreciate it.